Go.
This is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and other places. My guest for this show is Steve Hassan. He is the author of The Cult of Trump, a leading cult expert, explains how the president uses mind control. He's a former cult member who was deprogrammed and who has helped thousands of others to be deprogrammed. He's an expert on undue influence, brainwashing, and unethical hypnosis, and the author of the best-selling book, Combating Cult Mind Control. He's a licensed mental health professional, and he's helped thousands of individuals and families recover from undue influence. He's the founding director of the Freedom of Mind Resource Center at freedomofmind.com. It's a coaching, consulting, and training organization dedicated to supporting individuals to have the freedom to think clearly and to freely consider how they want to live their lives. He's been an instructor or an invited presenter at Harvard since 1999. And we're going to talk about what makes a person vulnerable to being lured into a cult, how people are lured in, how people change when they're in a cult, how to help them leave, and what is the makeup of cult leaders. So thanks for being here.
Online.
Yeah. So to start off with, why'd you write this book?
I wrote this book because my agent asked me, would I write a book called The Cult of Trump? All my other books are about the generic brainwashing and mind control, telling my story, telling stories of other people, talking about how to identify cults, etc. But I felt like it was my duty as a citizen, as someone who was involved with a cult, the Moonies, back in the 70s, which is how I got interested, which was basically a right-wing fascist cult. I even fasted for Richard Nixon during Watergate because God wanted Nixon to be president, I was told, and I believed it. And I just feel like we're at a historical moment where my unique expertise of over 40 years needs to be brought to bear on what's happening in the United States and its impact on the world.
What do you want the book to accomplish?
So what I'm hoping is to put on the map the basic reality that we're living in the 21st century, knowledge about how the mind works, neuroscience, the interface with the digital sphere needs to be brought to the public to understand anyone is vulnerable to being mind controlled, to being deceived and manipulated and influenced and indoctrinated, and that there really is a way of discerning ethical influence from unethical influence, from facts and evidence-based reality from propaganda and disinformation and lies. So I want everybody to understand this is a phenomenon that's affecting millions of people around the world in terms of trafficking, in terms of extremist terrorist groups, religious cults, political cults, multi-level marketing cults. The knowledge of how to manipulate people for power, money, and sex is in the domain. So what I'm hoping when people will pick up and read this book is that they will not only have a model for understanding behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control, but they'll also understand the history of propaganda and how that has evolved and what it is today, what I refer to as fourth generation warfare is the official term that William Lynn came up with. I want people to understand how the media has become centralized and how checks and balances in the media have been taken away so that there's no accountability, that people are getting actual factual information. And this has been amplified on platforms like Facebook. I wanted people to understand the stereotypical profiles of cult leaders, which is essentially malignant narcissism. I also wanted people to understand who were the puppeteers who were influencing the Trump administration, including Putin, including Opus Dei, the family as another cult, the New Apostolic Reformation, the alt-right. So many other groups have been influencing this administration. I also wanted people to understand the followership. And many of these folks are actually members of groups that I would characterize as destructive authoritarian cults. I also put in a chapter on how to help people start to reality test and how to start thinking again for themselves. And then my final sum up chapter are structural things that I think that need to be put in place to preserve democracy and how to move forward in a way that makes sense to preserve human rights. So that's a short summation of what I covered in the book. So far, the media in the couple of months since the book came out has been focusing more on, is it a cult and why do you say so, versus the whole history and understanding of the psychology of influence, social psychology, hypnosis, rather than going into the depths of what really people need to understand about why things are the way they are.
And frankly, you grabbed my attention because just seeing the title of the book, it helped me to rethink. You know, I have people I love who are Trump supporters.
Me too, by the way.
They're smart, they're caring, they're good people. And it's really hard to explain it. When I talk to many people, they think, oh, they're idiots, they're stupid, they're ignorant, and they're not.
Exactly, they're not at all. I come from a extra honors background, educated. When I was taken into the Moonies, and I can tell you most of my clients that I work with are above average intelligence, from good families with education. So one of the main points I'd like to convey from anyone listening to this is to stop blaming the victims, or stop saying that anyone who believes is stupid or they're crazy or they're weak, and realize no, actually they've been deceived and they've been systematically indoctrinated into a very black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil model of reality, and it keeps getting reinforced by the media that they choose to continue to listen to or read or watch. And there's not a lot of critical analytic thinking. So, for example, and this is going to maybe upset some of the listeners who are Trump supporters, but if you actually sit and read the Mueller report, you cannot escape the conclusion that the Russians were very systematically and deeply involved with manipulating and influencing Donald Trump's election, and that there was an incredible amount of evidence, and in fact, over 1,000 former Department of Justice prosecutors said there's overwhelming evidence that Trump obstructed justice. And it was just the memo, the anonymous memo, we don't know who wrote the memo, that said you can't indict a sitting president, that kept Robert Mueller from actually implementing what he should have been able to implement. But he said, because we can't, I'm just preserving the evidence for when he's no longer in power. And then later he testified and said, this is up to Congress to impeach. But even Congress did not do the impeachment based on the substance of the Mueller report. But I can't tell you how many of the people I've interacted with who were Trump supporters who just dismissed the Mueller report, but they never read it for themselves. They just heard.
This is a characteristic of cult members.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. William Barr said that, it found no evidence of wrongdoing, everything's fine. But people didn't understand William Barr is involved with Opus Dei, and that the founder of this Catholic right-wing cultish group said it's okay to lie for God.
And the same with the family, I believe, too.
I have yet to see the evidence connecting him directly to the family other than Trump and Pence. Pence, we know, was recruited into the family by Chuck Colson, who was one of the Watergate people from Nixon. And I should say my former cult leader was involved with the family as well.
Really?
So there's another link here with the present administration.
And I interviewed Jeff Charlotte, who wrote a book about the family, and I'll put the link to that interview in the notes for this interview.
Yeah, his books were very important to the research I did in my book, and he was the executive producer of a Netflix docuseries based on his two books that is highly recommended watching.
What's the title of the docuseries?
The Family.
The Family. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's so many things I want to cover with you, but so basically what you just said, though, is that presenting evidence to cult members really isn't that effective.
So the issue is they're programmed to dismiss it. So if you're indoctrinated to believe anything against your leader, your guru, your doctrine, or your organization is fake news, or it's from an evil conspiracy that's trying to entrap, and is run by pedophiles, you're going to dismiss it. Just like in the Moonies, I was taught to dismiss it as communist propaganda against father and against the family. That was the name of our cult.
And worse than that, you actually, you were afraid you were going to go to hell.
Yes. So coming from a middle-class Jewish family, I didn't believe in Satan. I didn't believe in demons. But within a few months of my recruitment into the cult, Moon actually rented a theater in Greenwich Village and brought several hundred Moonies to watch the Exorcist movie that came out in 1974. And then we drove up in vans to Tarrytown, and he gave a lecture about how God made the Exorcist movie. And this movie was a prophecy of what would happen to you if you ever left the Unification Church. So at that point, having watched the movie and was incredibly scared, I was afraid of my own thoughts. I was afraid of invisible entities trying to invade me every time I had a doubt or a question about anything I was learning. A lot of members of political cults and other cults don't have the metaphysical thing with evil spirits, but they have this indoctrination that the leader has the only solution to keep the planet from blowing up. And a key point with people who are under mind control, Rob, is that in their mind they can't imagine a world where the leader in the cult doesn't exist. They can't imagine leaving and being happy and fulfilled. They can only generate negative movies in their head. They can only hear negative voices in their head. The minute they can think, oh, maybe I'll leave, this Scientology. Maybe I'll leave LaRouche. Maybe I'll leave Rajneesh. I think I'd like to. They're already on their way out to recover their critical faculties and start reality testing.
But it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, you're a specialist at this because the average family is often not very successful at working with their family members who have become a part of a cult.
Right. And that's because people don't understand, they haven't taken the time to learn about mind control or mind control cults. And so the average person, when they have a family member or a friend, they try to argue rationally. Rob, wake up. Can't you see? It's a cult, And what they don't understand is that drives the person deeper in versus, wow, so you believe in Sun Myung Moon or you believe in Donald Trump. When was it that you decided that you thought he was someone worthwhile, thinking about, or that you started thinking about voting for him? And you get the person back in time before they started getting indoctrinated. And so I'll ask people, when was the first time you heard of Donald Trump? Oh, he was a rip-off real estate person, or he was doing a reality TV show, The Apprentice. did you watch The Apprentice? Well, if people watched it season after season for 14 years, they were going to have a very sanitized view of Donald Trump as a very successful billionaire person, because everything was edited out that didn't support that, false image about Donald Trump. But a lot of people thought he was terrible. Mitt Romney gave a lecture about what a con man he was. All the other Republican contenders for the presidency had terrible things to say about him, including Lindsey Graham. So, but going back in time, remembering that and going, so what was it that got you to the point where you're willing to believe anything he says, even though he's told over 13,000 documented lies? Like, help us walk through these points. And again, it's a matter of the average person thinks they're invulnerable to mind control. They think, I'm too smart. I made these decisions myself, because that's what I thought in the Moonies, even though my family and friends were like, Steve, you're a creative writing major. They made you throw out all your poetry. How could you justify that? But they never pursued it in a respectful, thoughtful, incremental way.
Well, keep going. You ask them about their early history with Trump. Then what do you do? How do people have that conversation?
So there really is a process of educating people that mind control exists, how to identify it. You want to identify groups that they would agree are destructive cults. So if you know the person and you watch the documentary on Jim Jones, or you watched a documentary on David Koresh or Warren Jeffs or any number of other cult leaders, that's a frame to then apply the BITE model: behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And I have a list of sub-variables under each one of those things. And you want to get people to understand this is the animal. This is what we know as destructive cultism. Then we want to get into, with Trump people, the two things that I found most helpful is talking about Chinese communist brainwashing, which we know that they're involved with doing right now on over 1 million Uyghurs and probably 3 million people in China. Or trafficking. Most people who are Trump supporters don't like sex traffickers and are willing to listen to conversations and evidence about pimp mind control techniques used to recruit and indoctrinate people and enslave people. And it's by going through those things to set a foundation to then get into a conversation about what are your thoughts about, what might cause you to reevaluate your commitment to Donald Trump. So I've had Trump supporters say, well, if he actually took out a gun and shot someone on Fifth Avenue, I wouldn't believe in him anymore. Because that was a quote that Donald Trump said, my people will still follow me even if I murder someone in cold blood on Fifth Avenue. But to get someone to say, here's a line in the sand that I won't cross, and that would cause me to disbelieve. And then you can continue. So what else? Like, if it could be proven to your satisfaction that Putin really was using hypnosis and mind control on Donald Trump, would you reevaluate your opinion of Trump? Well, of course, but he hasn't done that. Okay, but if it can be proven to your satisfaction. So you want to empower people to identify for themselves what criteria would they use to reevaluate, and then ask more questions that, would you watch this video with me? I'd like to get your take on it. So
what video?
So for example, one video that I really like a lot is called The Brainwashing of My Dad by Jen Senko, Senko. And she did a documentary about how her father went from being a very regular guy with good values and compassion to a very racist, very totalitarian, authoritarian person. He had a radical personality change. And in the documentary, she interviewed like Kathleen Taylor, who's a neuroscientist from the United Kingdom, who wrote a book called Brainwashing, the Science of Thought Control. She's in the interview. She interviews former Republican strategists like Luntz, who wrote the book Words That Work, or
Frank
Noam
Luntz.
Chomsky. And towards the end, he has, I think he gets ill. He's away from Fox and from talk radio, and he like repersonalizes. And he comes back.
Repersonalized. What
Yeah,
is
he
that?
comes back to his old self, his old loving, as opposed to this radicalized self that you will see in the movie. And it gives a lot of hope that, this is not a permanent thing, but in fact, you need the constant or near constant reinforcement to keep up the beliefs that are so antithetical to who you were before, and your family and your friends and your social network.
Okay, so we need to take a brief break, and then we're going to come back and talk about how to get Trump people to realize that they're in a cult. And then we'll talk about some of the characteristics of being in a cult and the people who are susceptible to it, and about cult leadership. Okay, so brief pause. Okay, so how do you get a Trump supporter to recognize that maybe they've got cult membership like characteristics going on? How would you present it to them?
So, Rob, the frame that I find useful is not a persuasion frame of you're in a cult and let me tell you why you are, because it's going to create a lot of defensiveness. It's not going to be productive at all. What does work is rapport and trust building, genuine compassion, respect, curiosity, willingness to share your own opinions, your own thoughts and feelings, and be challenged on them too. And it's an engaged process where what I say to all my clients, because this is how I make a living, by the way, families hire me to help get a loved one who's involved with a totalist cult out.
Has anybody hired you to deprogram a Trump
No.
cult? No? Okay.
No, I'm waiting. That would be nice. I would love that. I've already done a lot of the research I need to do already. But the point, in other words, is not to persuade the person, but to go on a journey with them to explore like what's real and what are our values and what do we want to do with our life. And I can tell you that people will be very resistant to the idea that they are in a cult, but I think that there's a lot of evidence, like Jeffrey Charlotte's books or his docuseries on Netflix, to make the case that the family is a destructive cult. And then if they watch that and they go, yeah, that's crazy, pseudo-Christian, wacky stuff that's involved with a lot of unethical stuff. You go, yeah, but he's the vice president who was charged with creating the cabinet. Like, what do you make of that? Then I can share about how Moon was at the National Prayer Breakfast, which is one of the creations of the family, and was ushered to meet Nixon in the White House, where he said, "We're going to support you as a president, and we're going to have my members fasting and praying for you on the Capitol stairs for 3 days." And Nixon loved it, right? So when people start learning about Opus Dei and listen to former members or start reading the books about that, it starts turning on light bulbs. Aha. And when they learn that Stephen Miller who's the architect behind his immigration program, has alt-right neo-Nazi beliefs and issues. So what do they think about that? And, you know, I'm Jewish, so I have some Jewish friends and relatives who are Trump supporters, and they're mostly aligned in terms of Israel and protection of Israel. They would be aghast to contemplate that really neo-Nazism is a real part of the actual administration on a very high level. So it's really a matter of step by step by step. Trump is not going to be president forever, and I'm hoping he's not going to be reelected in November. But I take the position that, you know, facts matter, truth matters. It's very important for people to understand all media that's critical of Trump is not fake, and people who are critical are not enemies of the people. Like, those are propaganda terms and cult mind control terms, and that in fact there are media that are committed to fact finding and what's known as error detection and correction in a media ecosystem, where if someone does report something that isn't exactly correct, they will be held accountable and will issue a retraction and a correction, which is what is not happening in the right media right now at all.
So we've got about a half an hour left, and I want to make sure we cover all the things. So describe what makes somebody vulnerable to become a member of a cult.
Good question. So the first response is we're human beings. We have 5 senses that are dependent on information coming in to us. And we are not rational agents, even though the legal system is based on that view that we make rational choices for everything. Social psychology and neuroscience demonstrates that, in fact, we have an unconscious that's being impacted all the time, that's actually influenced by internal models that we have in our mind about how to make decisions.
Well, and like I write about in my book, Bottom Up Revolution, that our neuroscience is such that we operate mostly from our prefrontal cortex, and it's 98% filtering what we experience, what we see, what we hear, and that's all pre-programmed filtering. So if somebody becomes a member of a cult, they're going to have their filters set up to ignore all kinds of stuff and focus on all kinds of stuff.
Exactly.
But what is it about a person that makes them vulnerable to?
So there's several parts to this answer. Very briefly, situational vulnerabilities are a major factor. So death of a loved one, illness, breakup of a relationship, losing a job, graduating, moving to a new city, state, or country, or living in a time where there's economic uncertainty, climate crisis happening, makes people look for a solution. Who's going to fix this mess?
I love the hero's journey, and the hero's journey is about how somebody gets a call to adventure to change their life.
Yep.
And what you described are a lot of the different kind of factors that can set somebody off on a hero's journey. But what I'm thinking is that those things can set somebody off into a dangerous one where it's already kind of prepackaged, designed to grab somebody who's vulnerable like that. And so they don't have to do all the regular kind of work of a heroic journey, but they think they are, and they end up being in the capture of this mind control system.
Right. And I can just tell you that the movie series The Matrix and the Red Pill is used by ISIS. It's used by a number of different cults I've worked with, as well as many people who are Trump supporters. This notion that the reality we think is real isn't, and that there's actually another story of what's actually happening. and it appeals to the desire to have a sense of control over complex circumstances, to have it ready packaged, that there is a solution. Here's the formula we need to go through. And part of the formula is following the leader, the guru, who often is the malignant narcissist who says, I know more than anybody else knows, and trust me, I can fix this. Give over your power to me, and I can fix this. And honestly, the key, I would also say that there's a technique that I describe in my book of hypnosis that I believe Donald Trump uses, where he's creating very emotional, vivid images in people's minds that's very sticky, where people, can't get it out of their mind, like build the wall or lock her up, or names, terrible caricature names. And people need to understand the techniques of it that he uses. And
I know that one of the most popular kinds of hypnosis is Ericksonian hypnosis.
Right, exactly.
Erickson, and that is really done as a conversation with the person.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So I first was exposed to Ericksonian hypnosis in a formal training setting in 1980. And it's something, I'm actually a certified member of the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis. As a mental health professional, I am not allowed to even teach hypnotic techniques to someone who isn't a mental health professional, nor do it on people without their permission. And when people ask me, can't you just hypnotize people out of cults? I probably could, but it's unethical. So what I do in my work is psychoeducational. I will explain what it is. I might show videos of other hypnotists and pause it and explain how the hypnotist is getting people to have their arm floating in air, or why people in a matter of a minute will be giving over their wallet and their house keys to a total stranger.
And I know with Ericksonian, there's a kind of a suggestive quality to the dialogue. Can you give an example of how that works, just so people can see how that could just fall into a regular conversation?
Yeah, so telling stories is one of the main things that Erickson did. But an example, Rob, would be, Rob, I'm wondering if you've ever considered paying attention to a part of your mind that's able to give you ideas that are very creative. And in fact, in maybe a minute or maybe an hour, or it could be while you're sleeping tonight, you're going to have a dream that's going to be very positive and give you some really new ideas. So what I didn't do the voice, Rob, which I could do, but the open-endedness, and you can't say no to anything I'm saying, and I'm allowing you to invest into whatever linguistic structures I'm offering. And it's also, I did it intentionally as a positive to activate creativity and unique ideas. So that's an example, as opposed to your eyelids are getting heavy, heavy, heavy. You're going into a trance, which some people will go, screw you. I don't trust you. I'm not closing my eyes for anything.
But I imagine they could also say things like, and you're going to find in your heart at some point that you can have trust in somebody outside of your ordinary world who you can believe in, or something.
Yeah, that's a good one. And one that a lot of religious Trump supporters is pray about it. Heavenly Father, and then on and on and on about, giving your heart to Jesus and knowing that these are the last days, and how God is using Trump as a King Cyrus-like figure, and da-da-da-da-da. That's, in my opinion, very trance-oriented versus you reciting a set prayer in a church service, or you praying internally, your own thoughts. But when other people are praying for you, or in the case of the New Apostolic Reformation groups, they believe in speaking in tongues, or otherwise known as glossolalia, or babbling, but they believe that they're ancient languages, even though linguists have recorded speaking in tongue and say this is not any type of ancient language, period. But it gets into your head. And as you said, when you have the filtering mechanisms installed, it suppresses your real identity. It suppresses your critical thinking faculties, and you're operating out of this part of the brain.
Maybe then stories are a way to reach people outside of their normal filters then.
Storytelling, and my wife is an anthropologist, and she did a book on storytelling, actually. She would argue that stories is the single most important thing that helped human beings evolve.
Ooh, I want to
the
know
way
about
of creating vicarious experiences that you can share with someone else, it helped them to learn and grow.
What's the name of her book?
Narratives in Human Evolution. It's Yale University Press. She actually argued, and I know you just were talking about the hero's journey. She argued that Darwin was using the hero myth when he wrote the theory of evolution, by taking the bones and applying it, to pre-human creatures. But she went on to a great career as a science writer at Harvard Medical School and as an anthropologist. But she argues that storytelling is a way of emotional grooming, like apes would groom each other and pick bugs out of people. How we tell stories about our day, and our partner tells their stories. It's a way of bonding. It's a way of growing. And there's strong emotional content.
So I've interrupted you when you were talking about the different ways that people become vulnerable to cults. I keep interrupting you.
Yeah, so for example, there's a bell-shaped curve, Rob, on people who are high hypnotizable and low hypnotizable. But most people are in the middle and are hypnotizable. But people who are high hypnotizable have a high capacity for concentration and imagination. And so if you're a high hypnotizable and you're watching YouTube videos that are very powerful, it's going to affect you in a much more powerful way than if you're a medium hypnotizable or a low hypnotizable person. So that's a vulnerability. I also have worked with a bunch of people who are high functioning, like Asperger's, high functioning autistic spectrum, where they are especially vulnerable to the love bombing of cult recruitment.
Love bombing? What's that?
Yeah. So that's effusive praise. Oh, Rob, you're so special. We're so glad to welcome you to our community because we need intelligent, educated people like you. For people on the spectrum, they have difficulty reading social cues due to their neurocircuitry. And they also like very, very clear, black and white guidelines for what are the rules. And cults are very black and white in their guidelines of rules.
And if some group tried to love bomb me, it would creep me out.
Right. So that's another feature. I just want to come back to people on the spectrum are being recruited at an abnormally high rate into these alt-right extremist terrorist groups. Because they're spending a lot of time online, and again, it's this social influence that's coming in through the YouTube and such. When I was in the Moonies, Rob, I was taught as a leader about recruitment to think about people as thinkers, feelers, doers, or believers. And if someone was a feeler, then love bombing would be appropriate. If someone was a thinker, it would need to be an intellectual appeal. If someone was a doer, you'd want to be talking about how to fix things and change the world in a practical sense. And if they're a believer, then you want to appeal to spiritual beliefs and find out what their history is. If they're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever, you always want to package it to fit, that. But in other words, you made me, expound on a very important principle of effective cult recruitment, is that they customize to fit who they're trying to recruit. And they leave out information deliberately because they know you might, get suspicious and not want to be involved, or they twist things or distort things, or they tell outright lies, like the women who recruited me into the Moonies said they weren't religious at all. And it was a blatant lie.
And now you were recruited by actually a couple women who kind of seduced you in.
It was 3-on-1, which turns out to be the magic number in social influence, by the way, of 3 people influencing a person. 4, it feels like you're being ganged up on. But 3 is one of the more magical numbers, it turns out.
Okay, so being on the autistic spectrum, hypnotizability, life circumstances, are there any other factors that make people more vulnerable?
The number one thing is ignorance about mind control and cults, and thinking you're too smart and you're invulnerable to getting recruited into one of these groups is the biggest vulnerability.
Now, but Trump supporters, is it recruitment that got them in, and where did the recruitment? I mean, I don't think there were 3 girls who are going to go and recruit some kid who's a bully in high school who seems to be like the kind of character who ends up becoming a Trump supporter.
No, not at all. So it really, you have to think about the complexity of Americans, and you have to think about each population will get drawn in from its special interest. If you're religious and you're against abortion, and your minister is telling you this is God's choice, that's going to be your route in. If you are struggling financially and you feel like the elites, the Wall Street elites are running the country, and Trump says, I got your back, we're going to reinvigorate the coal industry and the farm industry and all of that, and you buy into those lies, that's an entry in. If you're a gun owner and you're afraid that the governments are going to take away your guns, that might be a way in. If you're pro-Israel and worried about terrorism against Israel, that may be a way in. In my research for the book, I learned that most people will vote the party they were born into. That goes for Democrats and Republicans. So there are a lot of people who are Republican who just wouldn't vote Democrat anyway. And so they would vote for Trump because he was the Republican nominee.
All right, so we need to take another break, and then we'll come back and let's talk about Trump and the kind of person who becomes a cult leader. And my guest for this show is Steve Hassan. He is the author of The Cult of Trump. A leading cult expert explains how the president uses mind control. He's a former cult member who was deprogrammed and who has helped thousands of others to be deprogrammed. So Trump is a cult leader. What is it? What are the characteristics of a cult leader?
Well, that was the beginning of my agreement to do the book, The Cult of Trump, was that it was so obvious to me that Trump displayed all the stereotypical qualities of a destructive cult leader: the grandiose, self-centered behavior, the fantasies of power, success, and attractiveness, the overwhelming need for praise and admiration, sense of entitlement, lack of empathy, the inability to step into anyone else's shoes. But then the malignant piece is the pathological lying, the envy, the sadism, the harassment, the paranoia, the violence. So when I thought of Moon, Hubbard, LaRouche, Jim Jones, David Koresh, Warren Jeffs, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, Shoko Asahara, the Sarin Gas cult leader, they all have these same qualities. So I started with the cult of personality of Donald Trump, based on his history, his misogynistic behavior, his assault on women, sexual assault on women and such. That's all stereotypical cult stuff. But then as I started researching the book, I started to realize, wow, what he's doing in the rallies and how many rallies he's doing is very different than past presidents or past presidential contenders. When I started looking at the control of the media and how he would, diss anything that was against him. One of the biggest patterns, and this is very untypical of presidents, is this pathological lying, which from a hypnosis point of view creates confusion in the average American's mind. Because how could he be the president of the United States and say that he knew there was information that Soleimani was going to bomb 4 embassies, and then his defense secretary, who talked him into doing it, his defense minister, said there was no such information. The average person can't handle that incongruity. It makes them confused and disoriented, and usually it makes them more dependent on the cult leader. But I talk about, the White House itself, the institution of the presidency, I argue in my book, is kind of cultish in and of itself. There's so much concentration of power, and there's so much esteem that's projected to whoever occupies the White House that one really wonders if Donald Trump never was in the White House, all these 63 million Americans, would they ever believe in Donald Trump? I think most wouldn't.
Yes, and I think that what that tells us is that it is so important that the person who becomes elected president has to have the integrity and character to not take advantage of the power that they inherit, the potential to get people to behave that way.
Yeah, exactly. And the checks and balances, and that's the beauty of our system, was the beauty of our system. The checks and balances, there was an ethics office that would tell the executive branch, hey, this is not kosher. You can't have foreign governments staying at your hotel that you continue to own. When people take the presidency, they divest themselves from any of their holdings and such. And this president said no. I'm going to have a G7 meeting at my estate. I think he did change his mind on that one. But it's I'm part of something called the World Mental Health Coalition that was set up by Yale forensic psychiatrist Bandy Lee, that has been calling on a full nonpartisan neuropsychiatric evaluation of Donald Trump from almost the beginning of his presidency. And she edited a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump that includes some of the top experts in the world, including one of my mentors, Robert J. Lifton, Philip Zimbardo of Stanford, who say this is not a stable person. He's a dangerous person. We're not diagnosing him because he's not our client, but we're saying, listen to his words, look at his behavior. This is an unstable person who has access to the nuclear codes, who can blow up the world. We have standards for people on nuclear submarines. They have to be tested every year to see whether they're stable to even be around a nuclear bomb. And yet we have invested in the President of the United States a unique power that he shouldn't have. And in fact, that's one of my suggestions in the final chapter. We need to change for future presidents. We have to take away I believe we should be evaluating people who want to be president to show that they're, they have empathy. For example, they're not pathological liars. They're not, criminals engaged in criminal contact. I went off on a little bit of
so let me just pull a couple last pieces, and we've got a couple minutes left.
Thank you.
So what early on you said that that cult leaders are malignant narcissists, and I would say some of them are psychopaths, is going all the way.
Well, the
And every
malignant part is the psychopathology.
Yeah, and every psychopath is a malignant narcissist as well. But there's also the factor of authoritarianism, and
Yes.
when I think about authoritarians, I think of two kinds. There's the one fraction of a percent are the people that want to tell people what to do, and then there are the 99% who want to be told what to do. And so, talk about authoritarianism and how that plays a role in cults.
So in my model of the influence continuum, it says ethical influence from unethical influence. These are authoritarian features on the destructive end of the influence continuum. In other words, on this side, there's informed consent. If you're a leader, there's accountability, responsibility, transparency, checks and balances. The authoritarian is elitist, it's deceptive, it's secretive, it's manipulative, they demand complete obedience. And as far as the population who succumb to an authoritarian leader, I think a big piece has to do with the media and the media's responsibility to the truth and to basic human rights. And to the rule of law. I didn't mention that in the psychopathology, but cult leaders all think they're above the law. Like the law doesn't apply to them. No, I don't need to reveal my tax returns. No, I don't need to let my staff respond to congressional subpoenas, even though all of the presidents have always been responsive to congressional subpoenas.
But is my idea that there are these authoritarian people who want to be told what to do? Is there something to that, you think?
So the answer is I do think so from my studies of developmental psychology. People who are raised, especially people who are corporally punished as a child, whether in a religious home or not, are trained to follow authority versus in homes where they're encouraged to think differently, to ask questions, where parents are developmentally appropriately encouraging the child to make mistakes and to learn from their mistakes. The authoritarian parent is always telling the kid what to think, how to act, what to do, and is never encouraging a locus of control in the child to mature and grow up to adulthood and to autonomy. It is something that people can learn to do, even if they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, or 60s, to develop a healthy sense of self. But if there was insecure attachment, if you were raised in an authoritarian mode in your childhood, there'll be this tendency to want to look to someone who's like the daddy figure or the mommy figure who's telling you what to think and what to do.
So those people are more likely and more vulnerable to being recruited into cults as
I would
well?
say because it's familiar. It's how their brains evolved initially was, follow the authority figure. There's a very important book I want to mention called The Holocaust Lessons by David Cooperson. And the reason he titled the book had to do with some research with people who rebelled against the Nazis and hid Jews. And then the one universal that variable was that the people who rebelled hadn't been corporally punished as children. And they were able to think, this is my friend, this is my neighbor. If somebody came and wanted me, would my neighbor help me? I need to protect my neighbor. And he has an incredibly important website called StopLegalChildAbuse.com. And he's arguing it should be illegal in the US, as it is in most civilized countries, to corporally punish kids with paddles, with belts, with sticks, even slapping kids. You're teaching kids violence versus using words and doing appropriate disciplines.
I just want to be clear. It's interesting. George Lakoff, who's kind of like the left's version uh, of, uh, of a wordsmith, a framer. He wrote a book that describes conservative parents as having that kind of child raising. But what I learned doing some polling was that liberals are also amenable to authoritarianism. And I mean, they're the ones that want big government, that want to set all these rules and what have you. So this is something that everybody is susceptible to,
It's
really.
not a left or right issue. And people have said, Trump supporters have said, can't you see there are left cults too? And I even wrote a blog. I said, yeah, Chinese communism is a cult, and it's, left wing, even though now they're into capitalism. They had been, more socialist, communist oriented. The bottom line, Rob, is that we're all human beings floating in space on planet Earth, and we have to grow up and realize that we need to make decisions based on survivability together and toleration of differences, and not being isolationist. We can't be isolationist in any real way, because weather patterns are affecting everybody. What's happening in Australia right now, what the earthquakes, other fires in the United States, etc. We're all interdependent, and global climate crisis is real. Go to the NASA website.
So what, we've got to wrap though. So what are the final messages that you want to give? How do you wrap your book? What do you want to have people leave this interview with? What ideas?
Well, I really want to make an appeal. I know a lot of people have Trump fatigue, and they may even, say, oh, I see the cover. Yup, it's a cult. But I want them to have the bones. I want them to have the meat of what it really means, of what's going on here. There have been issues developing over 50, 60, 70 years that need to be addressed structurally. But most importantly, people need to understand everyone is vulnerable to mind control, and everyone is capable of learning that, what I've been believing is not working, and it's not true. And it's time to change my point of view. And I'm not a bad person because I believed it. I was tricked. I was indoctrinated. And if I could go back in time knowing what I know now, I wouldn't make those choices. I would never have gotten into the Moonies if I understood I was going to become a right-wing fascist.
Are there stories that you would recommend that people tell to somebody they're trying to get out of a cult? Are there any myths or stories or movies?
The best stories are stories of former cult members in other cults. If a Trump person is willing to look at the Leah Remini series on Scientology, for example, or if they're willing to look at documentary Holy Hell on Netflix, or The Family. There are many very excellent books that have been written. Many of them are people have done podcasts. And the thing is you can say to a Trump person, give me something to read, I'll read it, and we'll discuss it. And I'll give you something to read, and we'll discuss it. But don't accept things in generalizations. Like, really discuss it. Do a due diligence. And you have to be willing to invest the time and effort. But if you love somebody, if it's a family member or a friend, always remind them, hey, I'm always going to be your friend, no matter what. We may disagree about Trump, but you're my friend, and I always want you in my life. If it's a relative, hey, you're my uncle, you're my cousin, I love you. If it's uncomfortable, we won't talk about Trump, but let's talk about everything else together.
Right.
Find common ground.
This has been a great interview. Really appreciate such valuable information. My guest for the show has been Steve Hassan. He's the author of The Cult of Trump. A leading cult expert explains how the president uses mind control. Thanks so much for being on the show. And your website is freedomofmind.com.
Yes, and I have a lot of blogs and interviews with other cult experts who've who've weighed in on how they agree with the central thesis and added other things. So I invite people to come to my website, follow me on Twitter at @cultexpert, and let's support each other and keep our eyes on freedom, supporting the Constitution, democracy, and truth, and facts.
Very
Thank
good.
you, Rob.
Hit the button.